say rightly so, because immigration from the South has become a major issue in politics, news report, and the lives of immigrants, especially in this region. There are more than 1 million immigrants from Mexico, Honduras, Puerto Rico, Latin America that live in the Chicagoland, Northwest Indiana region. So it just seemed right that we would begin and focus this whole conference on immigration and migration from Latin America. The Center for Global Studies, which is housed in the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at Purdue, is sponsoring this conference. But as you can see from the back of the brochure, there are a number of other contributors to the conference. I just wanted to recognize members of the Advisory Board of Global Studies, who each have contributed greatly to this event. The person that's going to be chairing the first session is Dr. Kathy Tobin. She's researched and published on Latin America. She's in the history department. Dr. Kenneth Kincaid, back there, raise your hand, Kenny. He's also in history. He teaches courses in global studies, and he's researched and published on Latin America. Dr. Amlan Mitra, back there. He's not in history. He's in economics, but he's researched and published on inequality and social justice, which obviously affects migration. Dr. Jose Castro Urioste, right here. He's in world languages, many publications, also written many plays, including the play that will be performed today at 7 o'clock, right here in this room, on this stage, Ceviche in Pittsburgh. It will be done today. I also want to recognize, and I cannot say enough about our graduate assistant, who began in the summer without any compensation. But this conference is a success because Lillian Napick, raise your hand, Lillian. She worked with this planning for the conference all during the summer. She arranged for our speakers. She arranged for these facilities, for the publicity, and organized the registration, which, did I already mention this? Over 300 people registered for the conference. We had to close registration a couple days ago because we were having more people coming to the conference than we were going to have for our buffet. I also want to recognize Juan Andrade, who's over here. Yes. He has a radio show on WLTH, Nuestra Comunidad, and he's interviewed people for this conference on his show, and he was a key participant in making this conference a success. So, as I said, and if you look at the schedule, Dr. Kathy Tobin will be chairing this first session, and she's going to be introducing the speakers that are identified in your schedule for today. Dr. Kathy Tobin.
So welcome. Yes, this is many months in planning, and we're thrilled with the turnout. So thank you very much for coming. There's so much I want to say, but our speakers are phenomenal, so I'm not going to take up much time. I'm going to introduce the first panel, which is on immigration rights and obstacles. One of our speakers, we're sorry to say, could not make it today because he has COVID. We're all familiar with that, and that's been happening at some conferences from time to time. So we're sad about that, but Professor Arts, who is a great researcher in this field, will be filling in. So our first panelist, and we'll hear from each of them, and then we will have time for questions. And there's a microphone there too. Our first panelist is Charia Galli, and she is Assistant Professor of Comparative Human Development at the University of Chicago, my alma mater. She received her PhD in sociology from the University of California, Los Angeles in 2020, and was a postdoctoral fellow at Cornell from 2020 to 2022. She studies Latin American migration to the U.S., focusing in particular on the experiences of children and asylum seekers, on how immigration policies shape migrants' lives, and on the role of nonprofits and volunteers in managing migration. She is the author of a book, Precarious Protections, Unaccompanied Minors Seeking Asylum in the United States, which is an ethnographic study chronicling the experiences and perspectives of Central American unaccompanied minors and their immigration attorneys as they seek refugee status in the U.S. asylum process. Currently, she is working on 2 studies. First, with the support of the American Bar Foundation's Access to Justice Scholars Program, and in collaboration with Dr. Tatiana Padilla from Boston University, she is studying access to legal representation and outcomes for unaccompanied minors in U.S. immigration courts. Second, with a team of research assistants, she is conducting an ethnographic study on the reception of asylum seekers in Chicago. So welcome, Dr. Galli.
Oh, okay, perfect. Oh. Hello, everyone. What a great turnout. Thanks so much for having me. Let me just fix this. I'm short, unfortunately. So here we go. So again, thanks for having me. Thank you for this introduction. Today, I want to share with you some of the key findings from my recently published book, Precarious Protections, which is an ethnographic study of the experiences of unaccompanied Central American kids as they apply for asylum in the U.S. So unaccompanied child migration is on the rise worldwide and in the United States, where we've seen over 750,000 children arrive at the border alone without their parents, the US-Mexico border, since we started keeping track in 2009. Most of these children come from 3 countries, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, countries that have very high rates of violence, which are places where teenagers are especially at risk of being targeted and victimized by gangs. So the key argument that I make in my book is that I consider my research participants, these teenagers from Central America, to be de facto refugees. This means individuals who are escaping conditions of life-threatening violence in their home countries. And yet, this by itself is not enough to guarantee that they'll be recognized as de jure refugees or refugees under the law, because of the very narrow ways in which the United States interprets asylum law. And the formal legal definition of the refugee is a person unable or unwilling to return to their home country due to a well-founded fear of persecution on account of 5 reasons: race, religion, nationality, or membership in a social group. So I think this quote by one of my immigration attorney respondents puts it really poignantly. She said, "Asylum law does not make common sense. I had more than one case where the thing that pushed them out the door wasn't what made their asylum case winnable. To me, that exposes the illogic of asylum law, that a person can be legitimately terrified and a child can have every right to claim a safe place to live from a common sense perspective, but not from a legal perspective." So in other words, we have this idea, this in the public imaginary, that people are being denied asylum because they file bogus claims. But really, it's the narrowness of our laws that are excluding children who flee violence from accessing protection. So let me tell you just a little bit about the intervention of the book kind of in our theoretical frameworks for understanding migration. So there's a lot of migration scholarship on the experiences of the children of immigrant and immigrant children as they adapt or assimilate to the United States. And scholars working in this realm have identified acculturation as the key mechanism that leads to successful outcomes, such as educational attainment or socioeconomic mobility. And acculturation is defined, we can define it as becoming Americanized, more similar to US-born peers, the process of acquiring English language skills and cultural values, a process that largely takes place in K-12 schools. However, in conducting research with this population of newly arrived teenagers to the US, I found that this conceptual framework really didn't explain their experience. They arrive late, they don't spend a lot of time in school, but on the other hand, from the moment when they first step foot on US soil, they interact really intensively with the immigration bureaucracy in detention facilities, in the court system, and they interact with these bureaucrats and nonprofit legal intermediaries who help them navigate these complex legal bureaucracies. So in the book, I draw on research in criminology and use this concept of legal socialization to explain the experiences of my research participants. And this is the process whereby individuals develop their relationship with the law and acquire ideas and law-related values and attitudes and reasoning capacities. So I'm going to tell you about the legal socialization of unaccompanied minors today and why it matters. But before I do so, a few more words just about the research itself. So this was my dissertation research that I conducted in Los Angeles. It was a very long study, and I spent over 4 years in nonprofit organizations where I shadowed immigration attorneys as they helped kids apply for asylum. And I also worked as a volunteer paralegal. I interviewed over 120 kids and their immigration attorneys as well. And the research spans and compares the Obama and Trump administrations. All right, so let's go on to the findings. So what do kids learn about U.S. asylum law and why does it matter? So there's this rhetoric that you might have heard in the media that asylum seekers, including kids, are these criminal masterminds almost that deviously, manipulate the system and to cheat their way into the country and file these bogus claims. So I was very interested in verifying whether this was true. So in my interviews with kids, I asked them what they knew about U.S. immigration and asylum law before migrating. Well, the answer was they didn't know anything about it, right? Particularly about asylum law, which is extremely complex. They knew nothing. And they also knew virtually nothing about some protections that exist at the US-Mexico border that make it slightly easier for an unaccompanied child to enter than for an adult. When kids arrive at the border, after they're detained, they're transferred to the custody of ORR, the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which detains them in these supposedly child-friendly facilities, euphemistically called shelters, while they identify a family member to release the kids to. So while they're detained in those facilities, kids in theory should receive Know Your Rights presentations where they're educated about U.S. immigration law. So I asked my participants what they had learned about their rights in this space. And tellingly, I found that kids did not retain information that they were learned about their rights in that space, but they did retain all sorts of messages that they received from the social workers working in these facilities about how to behave like good kids after their release, and not join gangs, be well behaved, avoid trouble, etc. These kind of very racialized messages that children of color more generally receive in the United States. So I found that it was really during their interactions with attorneys working in nonprofits that kids really started to learn about the law and their rights as a protected category of immigrants in the US. And what I'll show you now is that I found that the wider the gap between the subjective ways in which kids subjectively understood why they fled their home countries and these formal legal categories, this narrow way we interpret asylum, who deserves asylum, the wider the gap was, the harder it was for children to state their case in the language of the law, which is crucial if they're to convince an asylum officer that they deserve this form of relief, which grants them a path to legal status and protection from deportation back to danger in their home countries. And I found that it was particularly hard for Indigenous children, for children with less formal schooling, and for younger children to learn to speak the language of the law. So I'll now share with you two examples from my fieldwork, one of a successful case of a young man who stated his case in this legal language and was granted asylum, and another who did not and was denied. So for Edgar, a 17-year-old from El Salvador, there was a relatively narrow gap between the subjective ways he understood why he had fled his home country and his eligibility under U.S. asylum law. During his very first meeting with his attorney, Edgar told his story of escape in these terms, quote, "The gang members said they wanted to kill me because my dad is a police officer." So Edgar's experiences fit under a particular social group that is defined as family ties. He was targeted because of his ties with his father, who was a police officer. But Edgar was also an older teenager. He was relatively more privileged than other unaccompanied minors I met during my fieldwork, and he had spent more time in school because he had never had to work to support his family. And this really showed. Edgar was exceptionally articulate, and he had a very critical understanding of the political context in El Salvador that many other unaccompanied minors who were younger or had less formal schooling really lacked. And these understandings are key to make your asylum case in a way that will convince the asylum officer to grant you relief. Furthermore, Edgar had excellent legal representation, something that not all children are guaranteed in the United States. Where most children must pay for their own private immigration attorney. Over the course of 5 meetings that lasted several hours, Edgar and his attorney together prepared a strong asylum case based on pre-existing asylum case law. And after all these meetings, Edgar had learned to state his case even more eloquently than he initially was able to upon his arrival, and the asylum officer granted him relief. Now, Francisco, on the other hand, also a 17-year-old, was denied asylum. Francisco was an indigenous youth from Guatemala whose asylum case was based on the eligibility grounds and the legal definition of race and political opinion. And he was denied asylum first at the asylum office and then, upon appeal, in immigration court. Francisco's case shows that sometimes the sophisticated legal arguments that attorneys use to craft their clients' asylum cases can backfire if youths are unable to internalize these arguments and learn to make their own case in these terms, is what I mean by speaking the language of the law. And this is more likely when there's a wide gap between the subjective understanding of why it is that someone fled and their eligibility under the law, as I mentioned. So unlike Edgar, Francisco had very limited formal schooling. He had started working when he was just 7 years old to support his family. Francisco's family was involved in land rights activism, but because of the very dangerous nature of these activities, they had shielded Francisco from participating and even knowing about these issues. So Francisco had limited information that was directly relevant to his asylum claim. And this was something that was pretty common among this population of unaccompanied minors. You know, these children were generally shielded by their family members from this scary information about why their relatives had been targeted and persecuted. And this information is key to a successful asylum claim. Furthermore, it had been near impossible to contact Francisco's family from Los Angeles to obtain more details to support his case because they lived in a really remote village in Guatemala where there was no phone service. And finally, another challenging aspect of preparing asylum cases based on race, the eligibility grounds of race, is that indigenous Central American youth often did not have a strong indigenous identity. And even if they didn't necessarily identify as a racial minority in the way that we would understand in the United States. Instead, asked why they were harmed, or bullied, or persecuted, they often rationalized that it wasn't because they were indigenous, but it was because they were poor. So let me show you an example. This is an excerpt from my field notes of an interaction between Francisco and his attorney in one of the many interviews that took place to prepare his asylum case. So it might be a little small to read, but I'll walk you through it now. So as you can see, Francisco found it challenging to describe who Latinos are. So the Latinos are the dominant mestizo or mixed racial group in Guatemala, and why they occupy a privileged position in Guatemalan society as compared to indigenous people. He was puzzled by the legal assistant's reference to skin color and by the attorney's remarks on the history of Spanish colonialism. The attorney wanted Francisco to show an awareness of racial hierarchies in Central America and even to articulate a political opinion in opposition to the Ladinos' dominance in society, which is what allows them to steal indigenous lands with impunity and what allowed this particular individual to target Francisco and threaten him, which is what led him to escape. Now, the problem is that Francisco's lawyer was using a conceptual vocabulary, indigenous rights activism, autonomy, colonialism, that Francisco completely lacked. And all the meetings that he had in the legal clinic to prepare his case weren't enough for him to gain an understanding of these issues. And he did not fare well in immigration court. The attorney representing the Department of Homeland Security convinced the judge to deny his case, arguing that race could not have motivated the persecution because the persecutor was a member of the same racial group because he had indigenous relatives. And this argument really shows you the lack of understanding that the US government has about the sending context in Central America. Unlike the US, where race is constructed in terms of the one-drop rule, in Guatemala, those who intermarry can blend into the dominant Ladino social group, a position of racial privilege that allowed this individual to harm Francisco. Because Francisco was ill-equipped to make his case, using these complex legal arguments, he was vulnerable to the attacks of US immigration officials who are far more interested in deporting children than they are in protecting them. So just to wrap up, so attorneys work in nonprofits that have very limited resources. They have high caseloads, which means they have limited time to teach kids about complex asylum law and their rights. These lessons are very difficult to grasp, and these are kids who are really highly traumatized from what happened to them in their home countries and their journeys to the US, and they're dealing with many other challenges as newcomers to this country. So it's hard for them to retain this information and to navigate the asylum process successfully. Despite attorneys' best attempts, I found that unaccompanied minors often did not fully understand their rights or the legal strategies attorneys pursued on their behalf. But I found that what they did internalize was a sort of hyper-awareness of punitive immigration law. This idea that if they made just one mistake, they could be deported. And I'll just end with the words of Linda from Honduras, which I think really reflect this reality. She said, "You have to be really careful. You have to follow the law. There's lots of things that one can't do. Immigration is seeing the things that I'm doing. They have my case number. They have all my information. They know everything I'm doing." So I'll end there. Here is a discount code if you want to buy the book, or you can get it for free from your library, which I'm sure also has it. Thank you so much for listening and for having me.
That was excellent. Thank you so much. And I'm so glad we have so many young people here from high school and college who might be able to identify with some of these stories very clearly. Thank you. So our next speaker is Claudia Lucero, and she is a longtime community organizer in the Chicago area. She was most recently executive director of Chicago Religious Leadership Network on Latin America, a faith-based organization. She served as board president of Alianza Americas, the only national Latino immigrant-led organization. Claudia was a founder of the National Alliance of Latin American and Caribbean Communities, now Alianza America, working as Midwest Regional Coordinator. She also served as the Leadership Program Coordinator for CONFEMEX. Am I pronouncing that correctly? CONFEMEX. The Confederation of Mexican Federations. For the last 20 years, Claudia has been a member of Durango Unido in Chicago, a hometown association, serving as president of Durango Unido in Chicago and CONFEMEX. Claudia was born in Durango, Mexico, and immigrated in 1990. She holds a bachelor's degree in Latin American Studies from the University of Illinois at Chicago. In 2006, She received the Top 40 Award from the Red Eye, a publication of the Chicago Tribune newspaper, for being a prominent leader during the 2006 mega marches for immigrant rights. And I was there, as were some of my students. Thank you very much. And now we're going to hear from Claudia.
Buenos días. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here, even though I'm not the director anymore. But still, I wanted to come and, be part of this conference and also, present my the experience and the work that I've been doing for so many years in Chicago. And when I saw the title of the presentation, that is Immigration Rights and Obstacles, I was like, wow, yeah, this is the kind of work that I've been doing, for more than 20 years. Either doing Know Your Rights workshops with Latino communities or at different panels talking about the same topics. And why it's important to talk about this? Because we need to promote the inclusivity in our societies. We live in a very diverse country, or I'm going to be focusing more like in Chicago, where I have my experience. And Chicago is a very diverse city, and as many other cities in the United States. And this is very important to also for the people to be informed of who are the immigrants, who we are, and what our contributions to this country, the contributions to our cities. It's also important to discuss the advocacy and the policy as well. What are the options that we have up there so that we can change the policies at different levels, at the local level, at the state level, or federal level? Even though, I don't want to sound negative, but there's no base right now at the federal level to really pass a comprehensive immigration reform, unfortunately. And it's very sad and it's very disturbing for the immigrant community. Why it's important to talk about, this topic is because it's a human rights, it's a social justice issue. We're talking about humans. We're talking about families that they're coming to this country because they want, and everyone should have access to safety, security, education, health, economic opportunities, regardless of our immigration status. That's why it's so important to talk about these topics. And it's also important to talk about what is the significance of immigration. And as I mentioned before, immigration has a very strong significance in terms of social, economic, and cultural. Because as immigrants, we come to this country, and as I mentioned before, we contribute not only economically, but social and cultural, right? What do you think are the reasons? And Dr. Galli, she mentioned before, but what do you think? What are the reasons that why people are coming to this country? And you can raise your hand. Yeah, opportunities. And I want to concentrate mostly like in the immigration corridor of Central America, Mexico, and the US. And yeah, we're talking about countries that are facing poverty, they're facing corruption, they're facing violence, and it's so difficult to live in those countries. And that's why, yeah, they're looking for an opportunities. Another reason, family reunification. Because sometimes we have people who is already here and they have families left in their countries of origin. Or people who are being prosecuted because of the violence. Maybe they're being prosecuted because of their political beliefs, religious beliefs, or even people from the LGBT community. There's some countries that they've been persecuted. Environmental climate change. And there's going to be a panel later on today about this. People also fleeing their countries because of that. And one of the main consequences, I mean, there's several ones, but I want to mention one. I mean, just an example for you to see is like, there's drought. So there's no land for people to grow their food. So they have to leave their homes and looking for the opportunities. And as I mentioned before at the beginning, as immigrants, we're human beings and we have rights. And we have the rights, the guarantee, and and those, you know, regardless of our status, because we're talking about humans. And one of those rights as like equal protection under the law. Immigrants, including undocumented, often have the right to equal protection under the law. And it should be that way, but it's not always the case. This means everybody should be treated fairly and without discrimination. Immigrants, they have the right to due process as well, which includes the right to a fair and impartial hearing before an immigration judge, the right to legal representation, and this is critical in the immigration cases. We also have the right to remain silent. This is one of the things that I was keep mentioning during the Know Your Rights workshops. Like if a police officer or an immigration officer knocks on your door and you're undocumented, this is one of the first things that we tell people, like, do not open the door and remain silent. Or if you're driving and a police officer stops you, again, remain silent. And you have the right to do that. And I think it's important to understand that. We also have the right to medical care. Labor rights. For immigrant workers, it's important to have the right to a safe working environment, fair wages, and protection. The right for education. The kids, even though immigrants or undocumented, they have the right to go to school. And we also have the right to go to a formal education as well. Universities. Not all the states in this country that has the in-state tuition for undocumented students. some of the youth, they probably don't have not even the DACA, the Defer Action for Youth. So we have the right to all those things. I was undocumented for 18 years in this country. And I had to stop when I graduated from high school, I had to go to community college. I had to pay out of pocket. Then I have to stop. I had a big gap in between. And then until finally Illinois approved the in-state tuition, I was able to, go to university. And it's important to know, for an undocumented person, it's important to know that they have the rights. Because this is going to empower that community. That person will know that if that person, she or he got stopped by a police officer, they have the right to remain silent, or if they knock on the door, they have the right not to open the door. They have the right to make a call. So those families, they should have like a plan, a family plan when those things happen. Have a number, either a lawyer or a family member or a friend to call when things like that happen. The challenges. We have a lot of challenges when we come to this country. For some of us, language is the first one. I remember when I came to this country and I was in high school and I couldn't speak English. The first year it was hard. For undocumented workers, jobs, as I mentioned before, we see a lot of wage theft, a lot of discrimination in jobs. Being undocumented put us in a very vulnerable condition that a lot of the times employers take advantage of that and they not even pay the minimum wage. They don't provide the minimum or the essential protection for workers when they, especially if they work like in danger job sites, like helmets or gloves, things like that. The healthcare. We have a lot of challenges there as well, because we don't have access to it. But we get sick. And one of the things that I wanted to point to in my last 2 minutes that I wanted to take the opportunity is that we can do a lot of things. As a community, we can get together and we can do a lot. One of the last projects, being a director at CRLN in Chicago, we formed a committee that was called the Sanctuary Working Group, and it was confirmed by people of working in service, nonprofit organizations, members of different congregations, and even families who were able to provide housing, temporary housing for the new arrivals. And this is very challenging, but it was like a very good model of it. They're still meeting every single week on Mondays over Zoom to discuss the different cases they had in the committee. Because most of those people also played a role as a case managers as well. Within the community, we got some lawyers willing to do pro bono representation for them. There were in the group, there were also like professional case managers that They're being very helpful in the work this Central Working Group is doing. And it was amazing to hear even some families like saying, you know, I have an apartment in the Airbnb platform and I'm willing to donate some of the time to house temporarily a family. I don't know, for 3 days, for 3 weeks, for a month, something like that. Because they have a big heart and they wanted to do something. So this is like an example of things that we can do. But we have to do it as a community, together. No matter if we are a US citizen or what is our status. It's just helping our neighbors, helping our families, helping our co-workers. And I wanted to leave with that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Claudia, for your personal stories and your work in Chicago. So we hope we have some questions about that too. So our final speaker on this panel is Dr. Lee Artz. He earned his PhD from the University of Iowa, a former machinist and union steelworker, is a professor of media studies and director of the Center for Global Studies at Purdue University Northwest. Artz has published 12 books, impressive to all of us, including Global Media Dialogues, Industry, Politics, and Culture, published this year, 2023. Spectacle and Diversity, Transnational Media and Global Culture, last year in 2022. And The Pink Tide, Media Access and Political Power in Latin America, 2017. He has contributed dozens of book chapters and journal articles on global media, U.S. popular culture, media practices, and social movements. He speaks regularly on media, contemporary politics, social movements, and global popular culture. Welcome, Dr. Artz.
As I opened earlier, this is a conference on Latin America, but I want to expand our understanding of migration, that it is a global issue and becoming more urgent. There is a global crush of crises, catastrophes, conflicts, and climate, and it cannot be ignored or explained any longer as simply random destructive events. Wars and climate events are not accidents. They are not accidents of nature or society. We live in a world in crisis that has been caused by destructive decisions by governments, politicians, and corporations seeking profits. We are verging on the end game. Nuclear war or climate collapse, the end of human existence. I'm not overstating the case here. And this is apparent in human migration. Nobody wakes up in the morning and says, I want to move to Turkey. Let's take my whole family. We're going to Italy. It's an act of survival. There's wars, there's bombs. Your village has been bombed. You're not going to stay there. The climate is such that you can no longer grow crops on the fields that you own. You're not going to stay there. The number of refugees worldwide is reaching an all-time high. According to the United Nations, there's 2 reasons, which is actually the theme of this conference. One is war and conflict, and the other is climate-based consequences on agriculture, employment, and housing. The Gobi Desert in Asia is getting drier and drier and drier. In fact, more than 20% of Mongolians have migrated out of Mongolia in the last decade. The Sahara Desert in Africa is expanding, which affects 20 nations in the Sahel. I read an article this morning where one woman was quoted as saying when she has a conversation with her neighbor, she gets sand in her teeth. That's what happens as the desert gets drier and wind comes. There's been mass migrations from northern Africa. 25,000 people have drowned in the last few years trying to get to Europe across the Mediterranean. Just this week, 7,000 migrants fleeing violence and poverty in northern Africa reached the Italian island of Lampedusa in the Mediterranean Sea. Fortunately, that group was rescued and were treated humanely, but it puts a tremendous strain on the Italian resources. Elsewhere, in Germany, immigration to Germany has increased dramatically. Between January and July of this year, close to 200,000 people applied for asylum, an 80% increase in applications. Most of the applicants were from Syria, Afghanistan, and Turkey. The number of Turks migrating to Germany to escape persecution tripled this year. Additionally, there's 1 million people from the Ukraine who have fled to Germany since Russia's invasion in 2022, February. Of course, they don't need to apply for asylum. Instead, they receive a residence for temporary protection authorized by the European Union. And 6 million refugees have fled Ukraine, mostly to avoid mandatory conscription. 2 million refugees from Eastern Ukraine have fled to Russia. Explain that to me later. War has raged in Syria since 2011. There are 6 million Syrians who are refugees in Turkey. Afghanistan is sinking into an humanitarian crisis, forcing many to migrate abroad. Yemen has already been identified by the UN as a humanitarian crisis, and migrants are leaving by the thousands every day. Last year in the United States, 1 million immigrants entered this country, wall or no wall. Mostly from the Congo, Syria, Burma, Afghanistan, and the Ukraine. You may not know this, but in Indiana, the state legislatures passed a fast-track driver's license and IDs for Ukrainians, but only Ukrainians. Haitians, Latin Americans, Middle East refugees don't have the same rights. The ACLU filed a suit that says this violates the U.S. Constitution and all the rights that Dr. Galli and Claudia just talked about. The racist overtones here are hard to miss. As one CBS correspondent explained at the start of the Ukraine war, the Ukrainians are blonde, blue-eyed Christians. They're just like us. They're not like Middle East refugees who are less deserving and are used to violence and destruction. This racist perspective is front and center when judging who is worthy and who is unworthy. I think that's clear in the status of Haitians trying to immigrate into the United States. It's long been the case with Mexican immigration, which is defended and continued, I know you don't want to hear it, by Biden's policies on refugees and immigration. Of course, since the 20-year-long U.S. war on terror, immigration from Africa and the Middle East has also exhibited further racial stereotypes against migrants from almost everywhere, except in the U.S. European bias towards the Ukraine. In other words, I want to emphasize here how U.S. interventions have directly caused mass migration due to war, violence, and environmental destruction. The U.S. has historically supported crews across Latin America, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Guatemala, and just more recently in Honduras, Haiti, Bolivia, and imposed sanctions on Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, and other countries. Meanwhile, television and the Democratic politicians tout precision bombing, droning in foreign nations. The actual devastation is largely unseen in the press, on TV, or in social media. You may not know it, but in Iraq, the United States organized dump trucks to fill in large parts of the Mesopotamia Valley to improve oil drilling, which destroyed the local habitat and livelihood for thousands of Iraqi farmers. Likewise, the U.S. bombing of Syrian oil refineries, water plants, bridges, and entire cities created toxic water, toxic soil, air pollution, and environmental destruction unseen since the first U.S. invasion of Iraq. Now, the U.S. is supplying internationally illegal cluster bombs to Ukraine, indiscriminately kill civilians. and the U.S. has already sent depleted uranium ammunition despite its international ban and evidence of its effects on U.S. and British troops and Iraqi and Yugoslavi civilians in recent years. Thus, it's unsurprising that thousands, millions are forced to migrate from the areas of conflict and environmental destruction. The Council on Foreign Relations, citing World Bank projections, says that 143 million migrants in the next 20 years will happen because of climate-driven crises. 143 million migrants from climate change. The PBS documentary that I talked about a minute ago reports that 90% of refugees in the world moved due to the climate. Here's something that's surprising. Lawsuits brought by youth in Montana and Pennsylvania are defending our constitutional rights to a safe environment. Court testimony included U.S. scientists that testified Montana teens will soon experience summer temperatures that in the 1950s only existed in the Mojave Desert. Texas youth will face 6 weeks of summer heat that normally occurred only once a year. A child in southeastern U.S. will spend more than half of the summer in heat waves, frequent floods, hurricanes, and cyclones. 3 administrations, Obama, Trump, and Biden, have vigorously fought back against these suits. This summer, a federal judge in Oregon ruled that the plaintiffs could proceed to trial, but it's in limbo because of the continued fierce opposition from Biden's Department of Justice, which has argued in court that U.S. citizens have no right, listen to this, you have no right to a safe climate. That's what Biden's Department of Justice is arguing in federal court. You have no right to a safe climate. Miles and acres of California and the Northwest have been consigned to future flames. Hundreds of thousands of residents in Phoenix died from burns this year, sustained by walking, falling, or lying on 146-degree sidewalks. The future freak flood victims from Tennessee to New York and the luckless denizens of Hurricane Alley, whose lives will be upended by many more and more powerful cyclones, partly caused by ocean temperatures of 100 degrees or more. Meanwhile, the White House has licensed drilling in the Willow region in Alaska and opened millions of acres to drilling in the Caribbean. Calm down, of course, you can always migrate to Canada. Sorry, you probably don't, because wildfires are destroying millions of acres, thousands of homes, and burning towns. My point is, this is not a U.S. problem alone. In fact, conditions are worse with fires, floods, hurricanes, and drought across the global south. There will be more migration around the world. Meanwhile, U.S. Congress spends billions for war in the Ukraine, leading to millions migrating, but can only find $700 for somebody that lost their home in the Maui fire. $700 if your home burned down, but we can give $100 billion to Ukraine. Low-intensity war, shock and awe, napalm, or cluster bombs, or war by proxy. Violence creates migration. War creates climate problems. The point here is that U.S. exports conflict to more than a dozen nations, actually, while programs to build back better funds oil drilling, coal production, and cuts back on environmental controls. There is a continued and growing conflict, continued and worsening climate change that has global consequences, especially including migration by the millions. So what is to be done? There's a panel later today that will talk about this more, but I just wanted to make my contribution. We cannot depend on elected officials. Obama, Trump, Biden, and their political supporters and corporate backers have consistently blocked humane treatment of refugees, immigrants, even children. History shows that only mass social movements have been able to win rights for women, Blacks, immigrants, or ending war and protecting the environment. Now more than ever, we need an energetic, well-organized, determined mass movement for immigrant rights, against U.S. war and defense of humanity and a sustainable environment.
Thank you, Dr. Arts. I knew that would be educational. I learned something new all the time from you. And for my students here from U.S. history from 1877 to the present, and I'm also teaching U.S. immigration, the history of U.S. immigration and ethnicity. We talk about some dreadful things, and we did this morning, actually, about eugenics policies leading to immigration restriction in the 1920s. But thank you for the education, and thank you to all our panelists. So we have time for questions. We have a microphone right there. If anyone has a question, you can come up to the microphone and you can ask questions of any one of our panelists. And we've got a microphone for them to answer as well. So opening it up for questions. Yes, come on up if you have a question. Oh, here's one first. Thank you. Is it working? Also, remember, we are offering lunch at 12:30 if you want to stick around for that.
For Lucero?
Some students are here from class for their classes, which actually end at 12:15. So that's all the ruckus. So, but please consider staying. Okay.
Hi, I just wanted to ask you, do you think that there is really an effort to do something about immigration? Because I often think it's just a political football that we want to continue to kick, but if you get rid of immigration, you get rid of the boogeyman. So I'm just wondering, what are we really doing about it? Why am I not hearing more voices? Why am I not hearing more anger and more social movement for that? I also don't hear about the Dreamers anymore. I don't know what's going on with the Dreamers. I had a friend who was scared to leave a job because she's a Dreamer. And she was afraid that it would cause people to dig too deeply. So I'm just wondering about that.
I'm going to thank you very much for your question. I'm going to ask the panelists to come up here and answer only because it looks like we have one camera.
Oh, okay. No.
Yeah, there's a very good question, and it's very unfortunate, and I don't think I have the answer. But one of the things that I have to say is that unfortunately, right now, like to change policies at the federal level, like I said, to come up with humane justice immigration law is very unlikely to happen. But there's things that we can do at the very local level, like, at the city council, policies that will help, not everybody, but maybe like a sector of the community. That's also like, the Dreamers. Yeah, this is unfortunately, they're still fighting in the courts. Because new people, they cannot, only the ones that have granted DACA, they can renew their status. But people who wanted to register for the first time, they can do it. They cannot do it. And yeah, I understand. This is one of the things that I was saying, they make you vulnerable because like the girl that you mentioned, she doesn't want to quit because she doesn't want to leave her job because where she's going to go. And this is, let's be honest, this is very, as an immigrants and undocumented, we represent, and they see us as a commodity, and we represent money. And this is one of the things I didn't have the opportunity to say during my presentation, but how many detention centers do you think there exist in the country? It's closer to 200 detention centers. And a lot of them are private. How much you think it costs per adult in a detention center? Make a guess. 125 per day. And this is a fact from 2021, but the two corporations that manage the detention centers, the Geo Group and the Core Civic, they gross 551 million and 552 million respectively during that year, the fiscal year. So yeah, I mean, this is money represent. That's what I said. I mean, they see the immigrants and undocumented especially as a commodity. This is very unfortunately.
Am I good to go now? My bad. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm just gonna do this, all right? Thanks for your question. So I just wanted to introduce a little glimmer of hope into the conversation, which has been quite dire this morning. I really focused on challenges during my presentation, but I will say that there is a lot that's being done on immigration. And so, my research participants, all of these attorneys working in nonprofit organizations in Los Angeles are doing tireless advocacy, which, I discuss at length in the book, which has an optimistic streak, because I do think that there are grounds to be optimistic. And I want, when students read the book, I want them to be inspired to go into immigration advocacy work. It's super important work. If it hadn't been for the tireless work of these immigration attorneys, the destruction of our existing human rights protections for vulnerable groups like children, like refugees, would have been so much greater. I mean, every single time the Trump administration introduced a policy that tried to chip away at existing rights and protections, all of these lawsuits were filed to fight back, a lot of which, were successful in delaying these restrictions. So it's not just the everyday work of representing individual immigrants in the system to try to get rights for a single person, but there's also all of this, class action lawsuits, impact litigation, which is crucial to fight back against this kind of enforcement focused, deportation focused streak in our system and to protect these rights. So I'm very hopeful in that kind of work. And to give you just one example, I mean, yes, the refugee definition, we interpret it very restrictively in this country, way too much to actually protect most people who flee violence. But at the same time, there's been crucial victories. I mean, under this kind of ambiguous particular social group grounds, it's now possible to get asylum for victims of domestic violence, for example, due to 20 years worth of lawsuits to try to seek protection for women from Central America and Mexico. Same thing with LGBTQI plus claimants who are being persecuted due to their sexuality. It's now possible, thanks to this tireless advocacy work, for them to get asylum. So, we do have some reason to be optimistic as well, but we can never let our guard down, and the work has to be done all of the time.
Okay, we have another question.
Okay. I would like to know what are your people's thoughts on the idea of anarchism, i.e., direct democracy in favor of representative democracy, worker cooperative type structures of government and society replacing more hierarchical ones. I ask because I and many others believe that one can only do so much positive change when ultimately, the system is rigged to benefit big corporations and government. So that's.
Thank you. Would anyone care to answer that? Thank you to our college students for asking
600.
questions like this.
I don't really have an answer, but I will say that, all of the opinion polls show that the American public's views on immigration policy are not those of the Republican Party, right? The Republican Party keeps catering to this base, which is a small minority of the electorate, right? The majority of the electorate is supportive of a pathway to legal status for Dreamers and many other groups of immigrants. So perhaps, that kind of speaks to your question in the sense that our elected representatives are not really doing what we want in terms of policy, right? So if there was an avenue for people to influence policy more directly or get what they want, perhaps things would be less dire and depressing.
That was a big question. It's difficult to try to answer it. It's something that probably would require a conversation. On the other hand, I don't share Dr. Galli's approach because I don't think it's just one party. I say a pox on both of the parties, pox on both of the wings of the House. I ask you to think about this. They showed you pictures when Trump was president of kids in cages.
Yeah.
You don't know that the kids in cages that they had filmed was when Obama was president.
Yes.
And they talked to you about how Biden is going to be more lax and stuff on immigration, but he's exactly adopted all of the policies that Trump had in place before. So he has not changed any of those policies. I would just say the larger question is one of democracy. And I think this is true, that what the American people think about immigration or abortion or the war in Ukraine or sanctions against Venezuela or affirmative action or higher pay for employees is drastically at odds with what people in Congress passed legislation for. It's completely at odds with that. So the question is, what do we do about it? I think of something like AI. There's a big discussion of AI. One of the things says, well, it's going to increase production. This is true, but it also probably would mean half of the people that work there get laid off. Well, here's another thought. Let's bring AI into our corporation to do the things that I don't want to do, but I'm only going to work 20 hours, not 40 hours. The company will still make the same amount of profit they were making before. They're just not going to double it. If we lived in a democracy, the people that say, let's use AI or surveillance of immigrants and others that the police use, we don't want to use it for that. Let us decide. The boss at I worked at U.S. Steel for a long time. The boss at U.S. Steel gets a vote. So do the other 50,000 people. You get your vote, you get your point of view, and then we vote on it. That's democracy. We don't have democracy in this country. We do not have it. What you want, if I were to do a survey in this audience of what people want, that isn't going to become a law because you only get to vote for somebody. And once they get elected to office, they're going to do damn well what they please. So your question is appropriate, but the conversation can't be resolved with one answer to one question. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Thank you. And we've got some more questions from students.
Hi, so it was clear there was a multitude of reasons why people immigrate or why they seek asylum. So I was curious, are there some reasons which are under-focused or maybe harsh to say, but some that are more valid than others or some that are more neglected or overused? Or I was just curious, each of your thoughts.
People have the right to immigrate.
Well, I'll say that usually people have multiple reasons to migrate, right? I focused very much on how violence prompts the migration of teenagers from Central America, but these same individuals usually have very complex reasons for migrating, which include family reunification, because a lot of them are both fleeing violence and also joining, family members, oftentimes mothers that they've been separated from for even a dozen years, right, since they were toddlers. they migrate because they have aspirations and hopes for the future, right, of a better future. And these reasons are both compatible, like you can be a refugee and want a better future, and they're also intertwined. So, for example, family structure and violence prompt migration in complex ways. So when children are left behind by parents who migrate, either mothers to flee domestic violence, for example, or to seek a better life, to support their children left behind, that kind of lack of parental supervision makes some of these kids more exposed to some forms of violence, both within the home, like child abuse by caretakers that they're left behind with, or to force gang recruitment. So, it's very hard to put people in boxes because people are complex and they have these multifaceted motivations to migrate. But when it comes to asylum law, you need that perfect story that fits under these eligibility categories that are very narrow. And the idea under the law is that who deserves asylum is much, much smaller than everyone who flees. So in my view, everyone who flees should deserve asylum, right? We, at the very least, need to have a refugee framework that protects people who are in danger of persecution in their home countries. But we have a long way to go to reach that. And then, you can make arguments about a broader right to migrate, certainly. And then we would be talking about different frameworks other than refugee law.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we do have a couple more questions. I'm going to watch the time, but we're good.
All right. I just so when the teenagers or kids get up here and they do get approved, what do they do? Like, how do they navigate and find their way through our culture? Like, they don't have parents or guardians to get them in school. They probably don't have a lot of money. What do they do? Like, to get through the world, like life?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, even the ones who fare well in the immigration bureaucracy itself and get asylum, they face a lot of challenges. I mean, one key issue is the fact that if you come to this country as a teenager, it's very hard to all of the sudden navigate a completely different school system in a different language. And so, kids face a lot of challenges. A lot of them drop out without completing their high school degree. And even in places like Los Angeles, which in some ways is the best case scenario for these children because there's a lot of bilingual educators, the LA Unified School District introduced all sorts of policies to assist the integration of these children. Even there, they really struggled. A lot of these kids have come with long periods of interrupted schooling, either because they've had to work from a young age to support their families, or because violence pushed them out of schools. And so it's very difficult for them to catch up. So many do drop out, but some do persevere and they end up finishing high school. And some of them have aspirations to go on to higher education. And then the thing that's really very horrible is that they don't qualify for in-state tuition a lot of the time, even in a place like California, because you have to have been in high school for a certain amount of years. And so they arrive too late to qualify for that benefit. So you can imagine this is a very low-income population, how hard it is for them to pay for college. So they're facing all of these obstacles. So for the most part, they end up in the labor force and working these very exploitative jobs. I don't know if you saw the New York Times expose of about all of these minors, unaccompanied minors, working these extremely exploitative jobs in U.S. industries like the makers of Cheetos, working for experiencing wage theft, dangerous working conditions. It's a huge, huge problem, right? And for the kids who aren't granted asylum and who lack legal status, they're even more vulnerable to exploitation and workplace harm and injury. So it's not easy, but again, a little bit of optimism. They're very resilient, a very resourceful group of young people. So, they do their best to integrate into this country. And, fundamentally, they have an opportunity to live safe lives if they're granted asylum and not be sent back home.
Thank you.
Yes, Claudia.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be the party pooper, but I think it's important for your question also to add that unaccompanied kids making their journey to the US is horrible. And I think it's important to put it on the table and to make it visual, because it's like crossing Mexico. Even though it's my country, I love it, but it's a hell. And yeah, I mean, we're talking about kids that are fleeing violence or domestic violence even at homes. So yeah, they're resilient, but going through that journey, I had the opportunity to visit several shelters or Casa de los Migrantes in Mexico, and I was able to see and talk to unaccompanied kids that they traveling by themselves, going through that journey. Sometimes they get together with other families and they accompany themselves, together, but it's hard. And they can also be victims of human trafficking. And they ended up there. So that's why I wanted to point it out, because it's very important for people to know.
Very good. And it looks like we do have one more question.
So as of recently, as of June 2023, certain states like Arkansas, New Jersey, Iowa, and New Hampshire have been aiming to repeal certain policies revolving child labor. And even now there's certain companies are facing accusations for exploitation. So I guess what I'm wondering is, at some point in the future, if not now, will states and worst case scenario, even the federal government include physical labor or other forms of work as a requirement for minors and other immigrants to be accepted for registration into the United States? And how would that either conflict with or involve other workers' unions?
Good question. Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I doubt that work will be a requirement for minors to get permits. If anything, I mean, at least as a matter of federal policy, and you're absolutely right about these individual states. I mean, this is a huge labor force that is very exploitable, right? Children, and this is the case worldwide. I mean, children are employed in very precarious, exploitative positions in, factories, agriculture. So it can be very lucrative to tap into that labor force. So of course, there's an incentive to do this. I know the Biden administration has been trying to introduce some protections to actually try to counter the child labor phenomenon. And, in the world of the helpers who interact with these children, but also, the immigration bureaucrats who don't necessarily want to help, they manage children in different ways. Child labor is very taboo. Like, these teenagers are hearing all the time, you can't work, you can't work, you can't work, you can't work. If you work, it can even harm your asylum case. So I don't see there being a radical shift in that sense. Fortunately, but then at the state level, you're right, we're seeing some very concerning trends.
Thank you very much. Did you want to respond as well? Okay. So thank you. I want to thank our panel. Very educational and enlightening. I especially want to remind the young people in the audience who are in various different majors and trying to figure out what to do with your futures. There is work to be done on the ground, either with nonprofits or volunteer work, working in education, working in public policy, government, law, immigration law. So keep thinking about these things. Whatever issues you are passionate about can help drive your decisions in your careers. And so I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Arts, and thank you very much.
Thank you to our panelists and Dr. Tobin for chairing the session. So I just have two quick announcements before we go to lunch. The first is I want to recognize Iris Sanchez, who's the director of the PNW Office of Hispanic Serving Institutes, which provided the lunch that you're about to have. The second is I want to draw your attention to the back left side of the room where the tables are. Carolyn and Pancho Rodea are going to perform during lunch, and then they will be back during our 5 to 7 o'clock tabling session. And they will be starting very shortly after we open the lunch. The lunch is through this room. There's a buffet, there's plates, there's drinks, there's much food. And I also want to thank Bert Costanza and Carberry. Alfredo Estrada will be speaking at the panel at 3:30 this afternoon, but Bert Costanza and Carberry provided a donation that helped us to get Carolyn and Pancho Rodea here to perform for you. So I wanted to recognize their contribution as well. It's time to eat.
The heroes for the food.